It's time to turn now to the version of idealism that was developed by Hegel, known as absolute idealism. Hegel, I will argue in this module, is the true father of post-Enlightenment correlativism, mutualism, or pantheism. You can look back at earlier lectures, but I use those terms in a roughly interchangeable way. Correlativism, mutualism, or pantheism is the view that eternity and time, to put it in abstract philosophical terms, or that God and the world, to put it in theological terms, are mutually determining of one another and reciprocally related to one another in a development over time. They are developmentally interdependent. That's the conception. In pantheism, or correlativism, as defined by Voss and Van Til, God and man are submerged in a common process of incremental development that consists in mutual limitation and mutual ignorance. Both Voss and Van Til, and this is very useful for you to remember, define pantheism as any essential or personal change in God as he relates to creatures in creation or to an assumed humanity in the incarnation. Hegel's most basic assertion about what is real and rational enshrines pantheism as thus defined in the grandest conceivable way of any philosopher in the history of the West. All of reality, he will argue, is the dialectical, triadic unfolding of Geist, which I'll define later, of the absolute, that incorporates finite subjects and objects into its consciousness as it moves toward the goal of perfect self-consciousness. W.T. Jones, in his History of Western Philosophy, Kant and the 19th Century, turns up a profound insight into Hegel's relation to Kant that we need to appreciate. Here's what Jones says. Hegel accepted Kant's Copernican revolution, his replacement of the notion of mind and objects as completely independent entities with the radically different notion that of mind and its objects as functionally related and as emerging together in experience. That's from page 110 of the Kant and the 19th Century volume. So for Hegel, mind and its objects, I'm going to put this up here. For Hegel, mind, and I'm going to put a capital M here, mind and its objects are first and foremost reciprocally related. Mind and object are reciprocally related. All minds, infinite or finite, are submerged together in experience, and they emerge together in experience. The key, according to Jones, is that Hegel conceives minds and objects, the eternal absolute and the historical particular, in a relation of mutually determining change as both emerge in a common developmental process. Now, in addition to this, and now we're going to get down to something of the deepest structure in Hegel. Hegel replaces substance with mind. So over here, I'm going to put substance, and I'm going to draw a big red X through it. Hegel replaces substance altogether with developmental consciousness. with mind as it develops through time. And he, therefore, replaces substance with developmental mind as his central metaphysical concept. Hegel rejects traditional Catholic and Reformed doctrine of a self-contained substance and replaces immutable and simple substance with developmental consciousness. Listen to this quote. Now, this is from the Phenomenology of Mind, 80, 113 and 114. Listen to this. In my view, a view which the developed exposition of the system itself can alone justify, everything depends on grasping and expressing the ultimate truth, not as substance, but as subject as well. It is essentially now thought. The ultimate truth is thought. Thought, here we find contained in the principle that being is thought. Now, that's the end of the quote. Ultimate truth for Hegel is the replacement of substance with mind, of substance with thought. Being is thought. That is the first key. And thought is reciprocally related to finite objects. Hegel, please be clear about this. Hegel does not affirm that ultimate truth exists in the immutable being of the tripersonal God. Hegel does not believe that ultimate truth consists in self-contained tripersonal substance at all. W.T. Jones comments on this quote from Hegel. Hegel's point is that he intends to replace the old metaphysics, which took for granted that substance was the prime metaphysical concept, with a new metaphysics based on the notion of thought or of consciousness. End of quote. This is Hegel's extension of the Copernican revolution, replacing the notion of self-contained and immutable substance with developmental consciousness. You can see already, I trust, that Hegel has left behind the ecumenical creeds and the Reformed confessions that teach that the triune God is one in his simple, immutable, and undivided substance. Once Hegel makes this move, his rejection of Orthodox Trinitarian theology has already occurred. But let us probe a little bit more deeply now. We'll have to do this in layers of development given the nature of Hegel's system and thought. Let us probe in more depth how the developing thought of the absolute relates to objects that emerge in its experience. How does this happen? We've stated two things. That mind or thought and finite objects are reciprocally related, and that mind or thought is the central metaphysical concept for Hegel, not substance. Out with substance. So Hegel continues, quote, owing to the nature which being thus has, and so far as what it has this nature from the point of view of knowledge, this thinking, this thought, this ultimate truth that is thought, or with a capital T, or mind with a capital M. He says this thinking is not an activity which treats content as something alien and external. It is not reflection into itself away from the content. Rather, since knowledge sees the content go back into its own proper inner nature, the activity of knowledge is absorbed back into that content, for it, the activity of thought, is the eminent self of the content and is also at the same time returned to itself. For this activity is pure self-identity in otherness. End of quote. Now, this is why many open Hegel and close him. But let me explain this. For Hegel, if being is thought, which he says it is, and if thought exists in relation to content distinct from thought, which it does, then the relation between thought and objects is not, listen, is not alien and external, but intrinsic and eternal, internal. The relation between mind and finite objects is a reciprocal relation that is intrinsic and internal. The mind that is thought, the finite objects for thought, do not exist in an external, alien, mechanical relation. They are reciprocally related in an internal and intrinsic way. And so you can think of it this way. Hegel is saying that the content that thought thinks is not something outside of thought, but something incorporated into thought. Now let me try to use something of an illustration that might be helpful. Notice Hegel's language. In the activity of knowing, the content of knowledge, the object, goes back into its own proper inner nature as it returns to the knower. So there's something like this. I've got these lines of reciprocal relation. Let me give you one more line. I want you to watch this. As the mind knows the object, that finite object that is known is transformed in the process of knowing it so that it returns to thought. It is not alien to and extrinsic to thought, but in the process of it being known, it returns to its own inner nature as an object for thought. So, as the mind goes out, I'm going to use some language here that might help. As the mind goes out to the object, there is an exitus, a departure. The mind departs, as it were, from itself to the object of consciousness. But because the relation is reciprocal, internal, and intrinsic, in Hegel's own language, there is a return which, if you know traditional classical theology, it is what? It is a reditus to thought. The mind goes out without the object in an exitus. The mind returns the object to itself in a reditus. There is a departure and a return, and the full circle here is that of incorporation. thought incorporates objects into its consciousness in a dynamic process. This is all, now please hear this, this is all interior to thought and objects as the two are conceived to exist, listen, in a single dynamic relation of interpenetration. A single dynamic relation of interpenetration. Mind penetrates into the object and returns the object to itself as incorporated. This is, if you're starting to see this, this is a micro movement of developmental mind or thought. Developmental mind or thought. It's the central metaphysical concept in Hegel's thought. And in this relation now, here's what I want you to see. In this relation, thought and object, mind and object, subjects and objects, or the subject and the objects for consciousness, are involved in mutual change. It's not just that mind is developing. It's not just that objects are developing. It's that mind is departing from itself, returning with objects to itself. And in this incorporating movement, mind develops as subjects and objects change, as the subject and its objects undergo change. Now, there's another language point here, a phrase that Hegel uses that you need to understand, and Jones brings this out, page 112. He says, this is now, this movement, this is the nature of experience. The nature of experience, singular. For Hegel, self-awareness in thought is awareness of content other than self. To be self-aware is for the mind to know itself as other than the content in the departure, and then existing in a relation of incorporation to that content in the return. The object is assimilated into and returns to the inner nature of mind as mind develops, and as mind develops with developing objects. This is going to sound abstract, but we'll stay on this. Thought is aware of objects as other than thought, relates to them in self-awareness, and then returns those objects to itself, incorporated in a process of development. Now, here's an interesting implication. And when W.T. Jones says this, you've got to remember he does not have a dogmatic dog in the fight. He is not interested in theology at all. He says this: if we accept Hegel's ultimate truth, I guess I should put this over, central metaphysical concept, ultimate truth, the ultimate truth of mind developing in symbiotic relation to objects. If we accept Hegel's ultimate truth that consciousness, not substance, is the prime metaphysical concept, we get a very different account of reality. In Hegel's view, the notions of independence and self-subsistence disappear. That is the end of the quote. Page 112, W.T. Jones. Independence, self-subsistence just disappears. Picture this board. Picture the slide off of the board. So that an independent, self-subsistent absolute disappears, slides off the board. So that everything, look, from this point forward, everything in this central metaphysical concept of ultimate truth is only and always and at every point historically developmental. That is Hegelian idea. That is mind. That is thought. That is the absolute. So the very conception of an independent, self-subsistent trinity vanishes instantly in this new Hegelian proposal. To use Van Til's language, there is no place for the self-contained ontological trinity at any point in Hegel's system. Instead, there is only a dialectical, progressive development of mind reciprocally and intrinsically and internally related to objects in this exitus and reditus of incorporation. Ultimate reality, then, is the development of thought in relation to emerging objects in experience. Now, Jones says this further to elaborate. The mind, please, these are all important, but I continue to be struck by the depth of what Hegel is saying and its overt, totalizing hostility to the self-contained ontological trinity. Hear this. This is Jones continuing to expand. The mind is not independent because it can never get away from its other or content. And if it were to free itself from its other, it would dissolve. For its being consists in experiencing content. Nor is the mind unchanging. On the contrary, it's changing all the time, developing, expanding, correcting, and revising itself and its experience. The end of quote. The ultimate truth, which is thought itself, not only does not exist apart from objects, but its very existence depends on its reciprocal relation to objects. Mutual determination at every point is affirmed because if you have mind without objects, it dissolves. It's the strongest expression of correlativism I've personally come across. So let's apply this to Van Til. Or let's apply this to traditional, reformed, confessional theology proper. Hegel says if ultimate truth, thought, were to be independent and self-subsistent, it would dissolve because thought and content exists in an all-embracing relation of mutual reciprocity. Thought does not and cannot exist apart from content and vice versa. Now, when you added now to this insight of absolute ontological interdependence, the Hegelian notion of the thought-content relation is that both are always immersed in mutual change. Hegel is telling us, and this is an extremely strong statement, that the absolute, self-contained, self-complete Trinity cannot exist, and if it does, cannot know the world. So either it can't exist, or if it does, it cannot relate to the world. Why? Because this is the nature of experience. Such a totalizing claim. The relation of mutual interdependence is constant development over time. So Jones says this to summarize. He says this: self and objects are not distinct, unchanging entities that face each other across a metaphysical and epistemological chasm. Self and object are structures within experience. There is no object without self, and there is no self without object. Do you see what he's done? He's taken Kant's interdependence theory, and he has made it cosmically all-inclusive. You just don't have absolute truth as mind without its content in finite objects. If you did have an independent, self-contained, self-subsistent God, it would disappear. This you can see quite clearly. I will put it this way: Hegel's correlativism is a correlativism than which few greater have been conceived in the history of Western philosophy.